Good morning, everybody. I'd like to call the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Health and Human Services to order. Madam Clerk, please take the roll.
I'd like to call the House Health Policy Committee to order. Would the clerk please take the roll? Thank you, Madam Clerk. I'm not used to this big of a committee, so I have to excuse me. The House Health Policy Committee will come to order. Would our clerk please take the roll? Here.
Here.
To announce the audience.
So I want to thank all of my colleagues from the Health Policy and DHHS subcommittees for coming in this morning for this very special meeting. January is National Human Trafficking Awareness Month. The actual day is on Saturday, the 11th. And so what is human trafficking? It sounds so scary, it sounds so foreign, it only happens in other places, it only happens in movies with Liam Neeson. But the reality is that we have individuals out there, friends, family, relatives, who are vulnerable and exploited, and that's what we want to bring to light here. So about 5 years ago, I made a friend in Ruth Rondon, who is a survivor, and she is here to tell her story. And the very important takeaway that I have with this is that with our initiatives with the CARES Task Force that Representative Appel and our colleagues have been doing over the past few years, and addressing the mental health needs of the people of Michigan and, of course, of our vulnerable individuals, is that human trafficking ties in with this, with childhood trauma and setting these kids up for being vulnerable and easy to take advantage of. So Ruth is going to tell us about her story, but she's also going to tie in ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, which hasn't been done at a state level. And I so appreciate your efforts on this, and thank you for being here today, Ruth. Ruth Rondon.
Members of the committee, I appreciate your time. In 1988, I was in jail doing 6 months for drug possession. I was 33 years old. When I went in, I wasn't even 100 pounds and I looked like hell. I was exhausted after being trafficked and drug addicted for 18 years. By the time I was released, I was drug-free and I was much healthier. And I was once again determined to start a new life. I was finally able to do it this time because, for one thing, my family took me back in. I'm very fortunate. I had a safe place to go. Since then, I remained gainfully employed. I became a contributing member of society. And I was consistent on following the 12-step program of Narcotics Anonymous. I worked hard at making amends. And I focused on self-improvement. And all of that paid off immensely. But for a long time, I still felt like there was something missing. And it was so frustrating because I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. Until I discovered the ACE study at age 58. The ACE study pushed me to revisit some very important steps of the 12-step program, especially step number 4, which reads, We made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. Years ago, I did take this step, but the ACE study made me realize that I needed to dig deeper. For those who never heard of the study, Dr. Vincent Felitti and Dr. Robert Onda are the ACE study researchers. I had the great honor of meeting with Dr. Felitti, and I'm so excited that he supports my work. A little bit about the study. The study began in the late 1990s. It started to get more attention in 2016. There were 17,000 middle-class urban Americans involved in the study, and it links child abuse to the risk of chronic diseases. The researchers created a questionnaire that lists 10 childhood traumas that people can check off to come up with their own ACE scores. Scores of 4 or higher are considered serious. And the most obvious medical problem of high ACE scores is mental health issues, like post-traumatic stress disorder and risky health behaviors. Hundreds of additional studies have been conducted based on the ACE study. Now we have the resilience questionnaire, and I think you all have that in front of you, right? This is what Dr. Vincent Felitti says about human trafficking victims. They are a group to which the ACE study directly applies and represent a population that will continue to add to the economic burden of chronic diseases on society if the proper public health attention is not given to this widespread problem. This is exactly why a trauma-informed care approach is so important in any given situation involving a traumatized victim. And this is exactly why we need policies that will enhance resilience in our children to fend off the effects of ACEs. In 2013 is when I first heard the study and about human trafficking. And I knew right away that I was a victim. And I wanted my story to be told. There were so many crimes committed against me that I never got justice for. But I didn't think I'd be able to tell my story because, for one thing, my memory failed me. And I tried hard to forget those 18 years of being trafficked and drug addicted. The traumas and the fear and the shame wouldn't let me forget. And it was just too painful to try to put them into words. Dr. Bezel van der Kolk says, a traumatic experience is so sudden and so overwhelming that it cannot be put into words. He says trauma escapes language and causes memory loss. This explains, in part, why I had such a hard time processing my traumas with my therapist. It also explains why traumatized victims are not good witnesses on the witness stand. Another obstacle I was faced with is, how do I tell my family? After everything I put them through, I'm sure the last thing they wanted to hear me say was that I was a victim. And the last thing I wanted to do was run a guilt trip on them. I'm the baby of 6. All 6 of us were abused and neglected at home. I guarded my trafficking secret from all of them for years. My drug addiction became obvious in my early 20s or so, but human trafficking wasn't even a word back then. And for a long time, I myself didn't even know that I was a victim. So with all these obstacles, without the words, and with a bad memory, how can I tell my story? Just before I retired, it dawned on me that most of my life is recorded in public records. So I did a lot of painful research, trying to make sense of my life. Then the Human Trafficking Law Clinic at the U of M helped me retrieve my police records and criminal charges. As I searched through these records, I felt the fear and the shame, as if it was happening all over again. I was a mess all over again. And I knew I couldn't continue on this dark path alone. So I signed up for advocacy services at the YWCA of West Central Michigan. And I had a wonderful therapist who walked alongside me on this research journey. She was the director of the the Rape Crisis Center. She allowed me to unload it all on her. And it was her calming presence that helped me persevere to the end. After a couple of years of this hard work, I was finally able to put my life story and some of my traumas into words. This was huge for me. This is when my mind stopped spinning. This kind of reflection is so healing. I recommend this kind of reflection to anybody who longs to make sense of their life, especially traumatized victims and human trafficking victims. Making sense of our stories helps us make sense of our mere existence. Now I understand why mental health professionals encourage their clients to keep a journal. Doing this difficult inner work allowed me to change the way my story ends. In my research, I learned how abuse is passed on from generation to generation and from era to era. It's all because of toxic shame. My parents, for instance, carried a lot of shame, and they passed it down to all of us. Our mom was a battered woman, and our dad was a raging alcoholic. He was in World War II. Neither one of them ever came to understand their own aces and release the pain and the shame from it. So they passed it down to all of us, unknowingly. I learned about life, sex, dating, and even puberty, all on my own, with no guidance. I learned the hard way, just like I'm sure they did. My mom and I, we were blessed to have had the opportunity to become the best of friends before she died. My dad died before we had the chance to rekindle our relationship. I can forgive them both. It's so much easier to do now because in my research, I learned that they had even less resources available to them in their lifetime than I had in mine. In my grandparents' and my parents' era, there was no such thing as domestic violence or a rape crisis center. Women didn't even have rights to divorce. War veterans, they suffered in silence themselves because nobody knew how to treat post-traumatic stress disorder back then. It was called shell shock. I'm sure long after the war was over, it lived on in my dad's head for years. We are going to flip it. Even though I can see now why I made those bad choices and become drug addicted, I can also see how I myself passed my own shame on and how I hurt so many as an adult and as a hardcore drug addict. History will repeat itself if you don't understand it. I'm doing what I can to break this cycle. Understanding leads to forgiveness and apologies, and they're both contagious. I want to make a note here. Forgiving others is not a necessary component of recovering from sex trafficking. It's a very personal decision. Forgiving ourselves is key to setting victims free. So how did it all start for me? From my research, I learned that my ACEs, my adverse childhood experiences, they groomed me for trafficking way before I met my trafficker. Not only was I abused and beaten and neglected at home, I was also bullied in school. And unknown to my family, I was raped several times before I was 13 years old. Carrying the shame of so much abuse at such a young age, it's what made me easy prey for traffickers. Not only did my parents fail me, the whole community, the whole system failed me. When I was 10 years old, I was raped by a stranger who lured me away from my sister and friends when we were at a shopping mall. When I told my parents, they exploded. They said I was a stupid whore, and my father beat me. So when I was raped again at age 12 by another predator in the neighborhood, I wasn't about to tell anybody about this rape. But when I was raped again at age 13, I couldn't hide this one from anybody. I was gang raped at a beer party by two grown men who bought beer for us kids in the neighborhood. I was so traumatized by this rape. All I could do was kick and scream, and I wouldn't talk to anybody. I was brought to the hospital by ambulance. There, I was interrogated by the police like I was the criminal. They threatened to take me to jail if I didn't talk. My parents, the police, and the hospital, they all knew I was raped. But nobody considered going after the rapist, even after the hospital told them that I had an STD. I was admitted to a mental hospital the very next day for 9 months. There, they tried to figure out what was wrong with me. Why was I so promiscuous? I thought everybody was blaming me because I was just a stupid whore, like my parents said. I thought I was beyond redemption, and I wanted to die. Dr. Robert Onda says, when people behave in apparently self-destructive ways, it's time to stop asking what's wrong with them and start asking what happened to them. By focusing only on my bad behavior, they all missed an opportunity to uncover the real criminals here and the other rapists and abusers in my life. Obviously, nothing changed when I got out of the mental institution. So when this sweet-talking boyfriend came around, when I was 15, he saw me as easy prey. Because I was easy prey. It was written all over my forehead. I was still desperate for love and attention. He was able to talk me into doing anything he wanted. He agreed with me that my family didn't love me. He said he would take care of me. I thought I had finally found my hero. He promised me the world, and I believed him. He took me shopping, bought me new clothes. When he told me his age, I felt privileged that a 27-year-old would be interested in me. And I told him all of my problems because I felt safe with him. When I confided in him about the rapes, this man made me believe I was stupid too, for letting those men have me for free. This added to my shame. I believed him. After several months of dating my hero, he very cleverly tricked me into walking right into a gang rape. Traffickers who pose as boyfriends very cleverly get their victims to agree to help them with some kind of a hardship, after they groom them with false promises and gifts. Then they forever blame them for walking into the abuse and for getting arrested. This is what happened to me. And I came to believe that it was all my fault, because I did agree to go to the gambling house with him to try to help him win some money back that he lost the night before. I had no idea how I could help him win that money back. I was so naive. At the time, I didn't know the gambling house was also a drug house and a brothel, and I figured he would appreciate it if I helped him out somehow. I had no idea that there were 4 grown men there, eagerly waiting for my arrival. My trafficker, or my boyfriend, apologized for the pain I endured. And he thanked me at the same time. And he reminded me that I agreed. I could never admit this to anybody. I was ready to guard this secret with my life. From that day on, he was no longer my hero. This was the beginning of 18 years of being trafficked. He forced me onto the street, and he beat me on a regular basis. But he continued to always apologize, and I accepted every time, because his apologies and his approvals made me feel safe again. I was so confused, just like he wanted me to be. I learned later in life that this is called the Stockholm Syndrome, or trauma bonding. I took all this confusion and shame with me into adulthood at age 18 and beyond, because I was suffering from relational poverty. There was nobody in my life to help me undo that confusion and break free from the cycle of abuse and shame that I was caught up in. As a teenager and as an adult on the street, I was repeatedly raped and beaten. I attempted suicide several times. I jumped out of windows to avoid beatings, and I was thrown out of cars. I jumped in cars with men who had every intention on killing me. Tell me, what little girl dreams of growing up to live like this? And I was even visiting the emergency department on a regular basis for beatings, for all kinds of infections and female health problems. And all the healthcare workers just looked the other way. And even today, I'm still looking for somebody to help me figure out how that affected me. At age 65, I still have health problems, and I don't know if it's because of that. My boyfriend introduced me to heroin when I was 16 years old, and I fell in love with it. It altered my reality. By the time I was 17, I was drug addicted. I had a lengthy police record, and I was a high school dropout. I knew my family wasn't proud of me. How could I be proud of myself? I believed there was no hope for me. My traffickers were also my drug suppliers, and my family couldn't figure out why I kept defending my abusive boyfriends. They got so sick of the lies and all my chaos, getting calls from the jails and the hospitals all the time. They had to let me go. When I was a teen, my siblings were starting their own families. They expected me to be a good role model to their children. After all, I am their aunt. I blamed them for years too. I accused them of abandoning me. I expected them to parent me. None of us knew what we were dealing with back then. None of us did. We had no resources. In adulthood, I do not claim to be a victim 100% of the time. I became a hardcore drug addict. I was not pleasant to be around, to put it pleasantly. In adulthood, this life did not continue just because I was addicted and just because I was brainwashed by my traffickers as a teenager. I can name 5 other attributes that kept me trapped and kept me dependent on my trafficker. I don't have time to go into all 7 of these, but I do want to focus on corruption for now. As we all know, there is corruption and abuse of power everywhere. No profession is exempt. By the time I was 20 years old, I was violated by teachers, counselors, doctors, law enforcement, and clergy. Being violated by authority figures is a different kind of violation. It kept me in my place. This kind of corruption keeps all victims in the margins of society. If they can't trust authority figures, who can they trust? I want to tell you a quick story. I will never forget this day. I was standing on a street corner one day. I did not want to be there. I wasn't even 20 years old, and I was still so naive. My trafficker was down the block watching me, and a van pulled up. And I noticed the driver was wearing a white clergy collar. I remember feeling so relieved to see him. I just knew he was going to offer me some help. That's just how naive I was. I looked back at my trafficker. He gave me the nod, and I eagerly approached this man's van. When he rolled down his window, I will never forget that warm smile. But when he offered me some money, I immediately became nauseated because the hopelessness at that moment was overwhelming. I know that was the day I accepted my fate, that I would never get off the street. Fast forward to 1983. I'm 28 years old, and I'm lying on a gurney again. Again, I was gang raped. But this time I was left for dead in an apple orchard. I did not want the police involved in this rape. I didn't want healthcare involved in this rape. I didn't call the police. Somebody else did. And I begged him not to. But even in my world of darkness, there was a kind detective who offered me a glimmer of hope. He questioned me at the hospital and said, "Hi, Ruth. I know you didn't ask for this life. You have rights, and we're going to get these guys." Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. I have rights. It took a while to wrap my head around that one. I ended up putting all my trust in this kind detective and in our legal system. And I told him everything. And I admitted that I got in the car with these men because I thought we were going to get some drugs. And again, this is another crime I never got justice for. When the police and healthcare were involved, I'm sure many said I had it coming. We have made a lot of progress fighting human trafficking, and law enforcement is being trained, and so is healthcare. And I finally did get some justice, April 24 of 2018, when the court finally acknowledged my victimization and expunged my prostitution charges. That was such a proud day for me because those charges haunted me for years. Back to 1988, when I was released from jail, I stayed with my 60-year-old mother. I was able to pay her rent money this time because I walked out of jail with a little money in my pocket from a lawsuit that I filed against a methadone clinic, when my counselor withheld my methadone from me until I submitted to his sexual demands. Once again, another authority figure who saw me as easy prey. And I got sick of it. I finally got mad. And I ended up snitching on him. I was always so afraid of that snitching label, but not this time. I passed a lie detector test, and we ended up settling out of court for only $10,000. And my lawyer got a third of that. But it was enough money to start anew. My trafficker was on his way to prison at the time, so I didn't have to hand over this money to any trafficker. Excuse me. And I didn't have to buy any drugs with it. And my family took me back in. So I bought me a $3,000 car. I signed up for a free computer class. I went on to get my GED. And I looked for work. And right away, I started counseling and Narcotics Anonymous meetings. I started counseling with a very kind counselor. He helped me take the blinders off. He helped me see that I am not beyond redemption, like I thought I was for so long, and like so many others thought I was. Knowing this is what helped me to forgive myself, which is what I really had to do to move forward. This is when I took step 2 of the 12-step program, which reads, "We came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity." You have to remember, human trafficking wasn't even a word back then, and I couldn't admit prostitution to anybody, not even to this counselor. We focused on my drug addiction and finding a job. He convinced me that I am just as forgivable as the next person, and that there's a forgiving employer out there just waiting for me to apply. And he was right. He said, "Be honest on your application about your record, Ruth. The truth will set you free." I was hired to work at a local gas station as a cashier in 1989. And in 1992, I was hired to work for the government as a clerk, and that's where I retired from. God really made the way for me. But I did relapse after being clean for almost a year. And my mother put her own life on the line. and rescued me from that drug house. From my research, I learned why I never relapsed again after that. It's because even at age 33, I finally got what I needed from my mother. She proved to me that I am worth fighting for. My mother died in 2013, right after I started this research. She ended up being my hero, and I ended up being hers in her old age. Growing up, my siblings and I saw violence as normal. We have come to forgive each other. Since we've been comparing notes, we're looking beneath the surface, and we're coming to understand each other a lot better. If it wasn't for my family, especially my two sisters, my sister Bonnie is with me here today, and if it wasn't for my therapist, I wouldn't be here today. I'll be spending the rest of my life trying to make up for all of those lost years. By sharing my victory story with you today, I'm taking step 12 of the 12-step program, which reads, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to others and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. I have a few more life lessons I want to pass on, just a few more minutes. The Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration says there are 6 key principles to trauma-informed care. As you can see, safety is number 1. For as long as I can remember, I never felt safe with healthcare or law enforcement. Just walking into a healthcare facility felt like I was walking into a police station. And I believe I acquired that attitude starting at age 13, when I was interrogated by the police at the hospital, when all 6 of these key principles were missing. After the apple orchard rape, the kind detective did everything right. Even though he never got justice for me, his warmth and concern at the hospital helped me see law enforcement and my own trafficking situation in a different perspective. When he interviewed me for a second time, his patience and understanding motivated me to go forward. I don't remember everything that he said, but some of the things he said I will never forget. And I want you to know what he said. Hi, Ruth. I have to ask you some difficult questions because I need specific information. I know this is not going to be easy for you, so take your time. If we need more time, we can meet again tomorrow. He said, try to be as honest as you possibly can and tell me everything that you can remember. He must have known that trauma escapes language and causes memory loss. He was the first one that showed a genuine interest in my side of the story, and I spilled my guts to him the best way I knew how. Maya Angelou says there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. I can attest to that. I told that detective everything. I know I wasn't a good witness. When traumatized victims, you have to remember, traumatized victims have a hard time being honest with even themselves because they carry an untold story inside them that even they can't make sense of or put into words. When the detective had the apple orchard rapist under heavy surveillance, I was arrested again. He had to come to the jail to tell me the bad news. But again, professional and respectful. He used direct and polite speech. He said, Ruth, I have bad news. I was forced to drop the investigation because the prosecutor feels we don't have enough evidence. I'm sorry, I did what I could. Of course, this was devastating news to me, and I cried and I cried. But looking back, I wish I would have held back the emotions and thanked him when I had the chance. I went years wanting to thank him. In 2015, my therapist told me that she knew the kind detective. He was retired, so I emailed him. She told me where he was working. I said, you may not remember me. He emailed me back and he said, I do indeed remember you. He said, I have had the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of many in my career, but you never know how much until you get an email like this one. My point is, this detective had the opportunity to make a difference in the lives of many in his career. Because he had no resources for himself, and because he had no resources to offer victims, I'm sure he felt beat down on his mission to protect and serve. Just as I felt beat down and lost all hope of ever escaping the hell that I was in. Today, 30 years later, I try to support victims who are still struggling or who are still trapped. And I find that they too are up against a broken system and a huge lack of resources. Even though I call it a broken system, it was that same broken system that helped me escape trafficking with that lawsuit. We simply need resources. We need the trauma-informed care to be implemented across the board to everybody who's fighting the good fight, who's on the front lines. Dr. Bezel van der Kolk, he has the perfect term for the difficult inner work I did. He calls it the reorganization of perception process. And I can attest to that. It is a process. For me, it was a very long process. It took years for me to get to where I'm at today. But I don't see it taking that long for the next generation because now we have the ACE study. I have learned so much from the ACE study, from therapy, and from being involved in anti-human trafficking work. Now I see my past, my present, and my future completely different. I see everything and everyone completely different. Victims and predators are everywhere. I have learned to navigate through life with my eyes and ears open. I have also learned to speak up. Don't get me wrong, I still have bad days, but I now have the support that I need. Thank you again, Madam Chair, for this opportunity, and members of the committee.
From the bottom of my heart, thank you.
You're welcome.
I heard your story just over 4.5 years ago and gave you a ride home, and you talked about every time you tell the story, you relive it. This takes so much strength, and it does not go unnoticed.
Thank you, Mary, but I do want to point out, the last time you heard me speak, I am speaking quite more strongly, don't you think? I was a mess the last time you heard
Yep,
me.
I didn't notice because I was such a mess. Yeah,
I have grown a lot stronger, and I have to credit the ACE study for that, and my therapist and my family, and you, everybody that's in this work.
And the fact that you drew it into how to help other people through this process and to help us as legislators and families and neighbors what we can do to help make a difference for children. So thank you. Do any members have a question for Ruth? No, I think everybody's pretty, Representative Stone.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for sharing your experience and helping to connect the dots between ACEs and outcomes. As an educator, being aware of ACEs in the last few years of my career really opened my eyes to what a lot of my students were facing on a daily basis. In your work, are you familiar with anyone in Michigan, schools, pediatricians, who are required to conduct ACE questionnaires on children, on members of the community to ascertain accurate understanding for populations growing up with serious ACEs?
I am not. I am a member of the ACEs Connection that Dr. Felitti referred me to, and there's a lot going on there. And there's also a Michigan ACE initiative, but I don't know of particular schools. My nephew works at Keasley High School, and he's seeing some changes there. I don't know if they ask the ACE questions, though. I was just recently referred to a trauma-informed doctor for the very first time in my life, Dr. Hudson at Mary Free Bed. He's got a multidisciplinary team. He has a pain clinic, a drug-free pain clinic. But that's about all I know in Michigan.
Thank you. I hope we use this to help provide prevention and interventions.
So thank you again, Ruth.
You're welcome.
So our next speaker is Kelly Carter from the Attorney General's office. There was a group of bills passed about 3 to 4 years ago that addressed human trafficking to bring Michigan from, I think it was a D or an F, to a B+. But part of that legislation was establishing a human trafficking commission under the Attorney General's department. And so for the past year or more, they have been working on ways that we can tighten up Michigan's laws. So Kelly Carter is here to give us marching orders and a plan going forward. Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair, committee members. Just by way of background, I am an Assistant Attorney General, and I'm in the Criminal Division. And for the past 9 years or so, my primary responsibility has been prosecuting human trafficking cases under Michigan's law against human trafficking. The commission was established in 2015 under the last large package of bills that went through in 2014. As part of the commission, I was appointed chair of the commission in 2017. That's a 14-member body. 5 of the positions are designees of various state agencies. The other 9 positions are appointed by the governor by rights of various forms of representation. As a general rule, the Human Trafficking Commission is by statute dedicated to conducting a number of duties, including identifying and gathering information about victim services, trying to fund and pursue research regarding human trafficking, simply because research and data on human trafficking is such an elusive feat for us. We also look at training and education, public awareness, and various forms of being able to fund efforts against human trafficking. And then primarily the idea of conducting survey and research into changes in policy and legislation that can aid in the efforts against human trafficking. And to that end, there have been multiple changes to the law, sort of a little bit here and there over the past several years since the commission has been established, including providing some greater protections for victims. I am in such awe of Ruth and the courage that she has to stand up and share her story. Her experience, although uniquely hers, is in some ways so very illustrative of so many other victims of trafficking. And I do want to point out, too, that when we're talking about trafficking, although Ruth was a victim of sex trafficking, that's just one form of trafficking. Also in the state of Michigan, we know that there are people who experience and we have victims of labor trafficking as well. And although their experience tends to be somewhat different from victims of sex trafficking, they are victims of the same exploitation. Really, I like to make the point that when we're talking about the crime of human trafficking, it is a crime of exploitation. And all too often, the focus is on the victim, as Ruth pointed out, what the victim does or what the victim did. Really, the focus should be on the fact that that victim is vulnerable in some way. And rather than focusing on the vulnerability of the victim, we need to make sure that we are focusing on the exploiter, the one who identifies that vulnerability and exploits it for their own personal gain. We need to make sure that in addition to protecting victims and providing support to help them with the vulnerabilities that they're facing or that they've now experienced as a result of their trafficking incidents, that we're also taking adequate steps to make sure that we are holding traffickers accountable. As long as we take efforts to hold traffickers accountable, we will help deter traffickers from trying to exploit those vulnerabilities of their victims. So to that end, the commission has spent a good deal of this year conducting a bit of a work group in looking at what the sort of next big steps are as far as trafficking legislation is concerned. Beginning in the middle of this year, we did convene a work group that included some legislators from both the House and the Senate, as well as both parties, in addition to other stakeholders in the fight against human trafficking, including law enforcement, including victim service providers, and others who are crucial to the fight against trafficking. While there were a great deal of proposed ideas in the interest of time and efficiency. We sort of honed that down into what was just last month at the most recent Michigan Human Trafficking Commission meeting, voted out as a recommended package of some 30 bills to look at the next steps as far as human trafficking is concerned. Now, that doesn't mean that this is all that there is to do, and we know that we still have a number of issues that need work as we go forward over the next couple of years. But I did want to thank you for the opportunity to come and talk about some of the things that we're looking at over this next year to be able to address some of these issues. Primarily, the work group sort of separated out our proposals into 3 basic categories that had sort of identified themselves: training, criminal justice, and funding. Unfortunately, our work on the funding issues continue, as I'm sure everyone here is aware. Finding appropriate, steady, dependable sources of funding for this sort of fight are challenging, and we continue to work on that challenge. However, we were able to come to a consensus on a number of issues, falling primarily into the training and criminal justice categories. As far as the training is concerned, sort of building on the success that was evident from a more recent mandate for training for human trafficking for health professionals. That was implemented in the 2014 package, and so not having any specific data, but sort of colloquially, I can convey that that has been a success. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is a 1-800 number that's operated across the country where people can call in and provide tips and information about suspected incidents of human trafficking. All of the reports from Michigan come back to trained law enforcement, and I'm one of the recipients of all of the reports that come into Michigan. And what I can tell you is that since there has been the mandate for the training for health professionals for human trafficking training, we've seen an increase in reports from health professionals calling and making reports to the tip line. So along those lines, and recognizing that adding a mandate to other licensed professionals is probably the first and best, easiest step, we've identified a number of other licensed professions to require some training of, those being commercial driving license holders. There's been a push across the country by a group some of folks may be familiar with called Truckers Against Trafficking, and they've sort of taken a lead in this area. That's an area where we anticipate that would be a relatively easy add, as well as educators and counselors who are licensed to practice in an educational setting. Again, having mandated training for those people who are in a readily accessible area to help identify and assist victims of trafficking is very important. In addition, cosmetologists who are already licensed, but adding a requirement to their ongoing licensure that they receive training for human trafficking, we feel is going to be helpful and beneficial. Now, unlike the prior healthcare professional mandate, there's some push or some recognition of the need that there needs to be some standards or some, some sort of guidelines as far as what sort of training is appropriate, because we want to make sure that people are getting accurate and sort of evidence-based information when they're getting this training. So as a corollary to that, we're proposing an amendment to the Human Trafficking Commission Act to add the requirement that the commission create and distribute required standards for training, required minimum standards for training, so that as we go on, I anticipate that we'll probably see additional mandates for training, that we're having some guidelines. So for instance, as Ruth has so vitally pointed out, the idea and the need for trauma-informed or victim-centered sort of training, so that we're able to take those those sort of facets into account. So in addition to training, we've also looked in the areas of criminal justice. Ruth, again, is a brilliant example of sort of the reasons that we are in need of additional criminal justice reform, especially in the area of protections for victims. So in addition to additional tools to hold traffickers accountable, one of the things, or some of the things that we want to do are making sure that we're strengthening protections for victims. The first round of human trafficking legislation included some protections for victims. So including in the law the idea that we don't treat victims of trafficking as criminals, but we treat them as victims of the crime that they've suffered. But we have ways that we can expand where we've already made some progress in those areas. So one of the previous tools that was employed to assist minor victims of trafficking was to include in the law a presumption that if there's any minor who is found in a commercial sexual activity situation, that they are presumed to be a victim of trafficking and therefore not subject to charges. And so that's been helpful and that's been successful. The original version of that statute included a complete bar to the benefits of that presumption if a minor failed to substantially comply with court-ordered services. In recognition of the fact, as Ruth pointed out, that oftentimes victims go through a journey, a process of success and setbacks as they're recovering from their trafficking situation, let alone the things that created the vulnerability that made them subject to trafficking in the first place. So this, in a sense, takes recognition of that and will not deprive a minor of the presumption, but now creates a discretionary situation where a court can consider the circumstances and still continue to afford a minor in those circumstances with that rebuttable presumption, that protection for their criminal liability for those actions. In addition, as Ruth pointed out, she was able to take advantage of one of the initial, other initial protections for victims of trafficking, which is the idea of expunging past convictions that were the direct result of human trafficking. Now, the initial implementation of that bill only provided for the expungement of prostitution offenses. And originally it said prostitution, and then we've gone through this sort of rebiting at the apple, because then it was made clear to us that we didn't include ordinances that were akin to the state prostitution law. So we expanded it to make sure that we were including that, and same thing with juveniles. But as we go along and as we hear Ruth's story, and again, Ruth's story, although unique to her, is in so many ways illustrative of what we see in so many circumstances, that victims of trafficking, especially sex trafficking, are not only forced to engage in the criminal act of prostitution, but we know that they are often forced as part of their trafficking to engage in other criminal acts, very commonly drug offenses, sometimes theft offenses, sometimes firearm offenses. There's a whole host of circumstances where we regularly hear of victims, because of the control of their traffickers, are engaging in these additional activities, not because they set out to commit a crime, but because they are under the influence of a person that causes that criminal act to happen. So, as a result of that greater universe of criminal actions that we know that victims are often subjected to, we're proposing to fully expand the sorts of expungement that a victim of human trafficking can pursue. There are still protections. It's not carte blanche. It's not a guarantee that any other crime that a human trafficking victim seeks to have expunged will absolutely be expunged, but it allows a victim to go to a court and to say, this is the circumstance under which this crime was committed, and allows them to fully inform the court as to the circumstances under which that crime was committed, and allows a court to clear that victim's record, again, of those criminal actions that were not committed with a mens rea, but were committed as a result of the force, fraud, and coercion of their trafficker. So we're very excited about that possibility that Ruth might be able to clear the rest of her criminal record beyond just those prostitution crimes. And there's also a proposal to extend that same protection to juvenile adjudications. Currently, they are subject to the same limitations as far as the prostitution offenses. In addition, we're looking at creating an affirmative defense for victims of human trafficking as well. So to the extent we're looking at expanding looking back at a victim's criminal record that has been committed in the past, we're looking at creating the same sort of path forward so that a victim of human trafficking who is currently facing charges for a crime that was committed as a direct result of their being a victim of human trafficking, that they would be able to defend against that crime and prevent that conviction from happening going forward. Also, too, we're looking at being able to strengthen prosecution tools to hold traffickers accountable. Again, there's this, it's sort of this vicious cycle when it comes to holding traffickers accountable, because we know that a victim of trafficking is often the best evidence against a trafficker. But as Ruth has so eloquently pointed out, oftentimes victims of trafficking don't come forward. They're afraid. They don't realize that they were victimized. All of these things go into a victim not necessarily being able to effectively participate in the process of holding traffickers accountable. So if we can make sure that we're including tools within the actual penal code to help codify the same sort of treatment that Ruth got from that detective that was so very helpful, then we might be able to develop better cases to not only rescue victims but prevent the victimization of others going forward by holding those traffickers accountable. So along those lines, some of the things that we're proposing are expanding the recently enacted allowance for expert testimony in human trafficking cases. A couple years ago, there was a bill passed that allows for expert testimony in human trafficking cases. And again, as Ruth so brilliantly illustrated, part of what we're looking at in human trafficking cases is we have a lot of unique and unusual behavior that sometimes we need to explain to a jury for them to completely understand a victim's experience and the ways in which a victim acts. So with regard to trauma and the physical effects of trauma, having expert testimony to be able to explain to a jury why a person would behave perhaps in a way that a juror might not necessarily see as logical is very helpful in us being able to move forward and holding traffickers accountable. And so really the expansion that we're talking about here is is codifying case law as far as what sort of expert qualifies, what sort of person qualifies as an expert to be able to provide that sort of testimony. In addition, in being able to protect victims in being able to participate in holding traffickers accountable. Currently, under the prostitution statute, there is a statutory immunity for those who provide testimony in a case under the prostitution chapter, most likely aimed at those engaging in prostitution at the hands of somebody else. This immunity is meant to recognize and identify the fact that in order to hold those accountable for the acts happening, we need to have the testimony of those who are involved. And so the legislature very wisely included immunity for those who are compelled to come to court to testify about these acts of prostitution happening, that they will not be held accountable for those acts to which they testify, which are criminal acts. It seems like a logical extension that we take that same statutory immunity and provide it in the human trafficking chapter, so that we're creating that same protection and incentive for folks to be able to come forward and testify about what has happened to them during the course of their trafficking, so that we might be more successful in holding their traffickers accountable. Also, too, we're looking at, there have been, over the past year or so, there's been some expansion of the sexual assault and domestic violence laws to address, some changes that have happened there. One of the areas that happened was there was an expansion of the propensity evidence. This is the idea that if somebody is charged with a like crime, then past instances of that same crime would be able to come in as evidence against that person. Recently, with regard to sexual assault and domestic violence, those were expanded to include more instances where that propensity evidence could be included. And we're thinking and proposing that human trafficking is a likely candidate for that same sort of expansion. And then finally, but perhaps in some ways more profoundly, there's, as part of the package, a number of bills that seek to essentially modernize the prostitution chapter as it is. It's hard to talk about sex trafficking without talking about prostitution. For years and years, again, as Ruth so eloquently demonstrated, we just thought it was just prostitution, right? That's just what she's doing. She's just doing it to get her drugs. And there's this sort of ingrained thought and judgment which comes with some of those words when we're looking at how those words are used and employed. And realizing that in order to shed light on sex trafficking and to appropriately address that under the appropriate perspective, it might be helpful if we just go ahead and remove the word prostitution from the penal code. Now, I point out as a background for this, interestingly enough, there is no definition for prostitution in the penal code. The word is used quite often, and there are crimes against it, but there is no definition for it. Instead, there is a definition for commercial sexual activity in the human trafficking chapter, which essentially describes what we had referred to as prostitution previously, a sex act in exchange for something of value. And so this is actually sort of working off of some bills that were originally introduced in 2018. But the idea of changing out the word prostitution for commercial sexual activity, this defined term within the penal code. And everywhere that the word prostitution occurs throughout Michigan law, changing that word out to the now defined term commercial sexual activity. But while that's a number of proposals in and of themselves based upon the various chapters or sections of the law where those happen, within the prostitution chapter itself, we figured that we needed to dive a little deeper. So rather than just changing out the terminology, what we did was took a closer look. There was certainly some ambiguity in the prostitution chapter, words such as solicit or encourage. It was never really clear, at least from a prosecutorial standpoint, who the particular crimes were aimed at, whether it's aimed at the person providing the act or the person who's obtaining the act, whichever way. So again, what we decided to do is sort of blow it all out and make it very clear. So in addition to providing the definition for commercial sexual activity now, we've specifically identified two crimes, or at least the prior crimes of solicitation. So now there's the crime of providing a commercial sexual act, and there's the crime of obtaining a commercial sexual act. And so within the crime of providing the Commercial Sexual Act, we've also included in there certain exemptions to allow for the realities of what we see in the world of commercial sexual activity. So in addition to allowing, carving out an area for protection for victims of human trafficking, where that commercial sex act is provided as a result of force, fraud, or coercion, it also became obvious that pandering, which is a 20-year felony, which is just shy of trafficking, offered no protections for the victims of pandering. So we're looking at creating protection for victims of pandering as well. So those for whom, who are providing a commercial sexual act through the coercion, promise, or all of the sort of pandering words involved as well. In addition, also in recognition of the realities of the world of commercial sexual activity, we know that the people who are obtaining a commercial sex act are at a different power place than the person providing a commercial sex act. We know that the person providing the commercial sex act is probably more often than not, unfortunately we do not have good data on this, but colloquially, folks within the industry will tell you that the vast majority of commercial sex acts are provided at the hands or through the influence of some other individual. So recognizing that sort of power indifference, another proposal that's included in our package is the idea that we reduce penalties for providers, so that those who are providing a commercial sex act will be subject only to misdemeanor penalties. But conversely, in recognition of the greater place of power that one who is obtaining commercial sex is coming from, we're looking at increasing penalties for obtaining a commercial sex act to felonies, so that the initial instance of obtaining a commercial sex act would be a 1-year felony. In addition to those sort of big changes, we're also looking at, again, in light of reflecting the state of commercial sexual activity that we're seeing it happen, removing the last of the archaic terms that are existing in that chapter. So if anyone's ever looked through the prostitution chapter, you will see such colorful terms as house of ill fame, bawdy house, house of prostitution. Those words are still existing in our criminal statutes today. Yet we know, while there is commercial sexual activity that is happening in some houses and other locations like that, really, we are seeing the vast majority of it these days happening in hotels or places of recreation or someplace outside of somebody's home. So using terminology that's broad enough and appropriate enough to be able to capture the realities of where we're seeing these sort of things happen. So that's just a brief outline of the some 30 or so bills recommended at our last commission meeting. And we look forward to the support and assistance of all of those who are interested in making sure that we are doing what we can to advise people, train people on what human trafficking is, to do what we can to support victims and protect them from the trafficking instances that are happening to them, and most importantly, to make sure that we have the appropriate tools to hold traffickers accountable. So I thank you, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, and welcome any questions.
Thank you so much. I ask that you extend our appreciation to the members of your commission, because I'm sure there were countless hours that went into this very important work. And I know a bunch of us who have been a part of this process for the past 5+ years and watching how things have transpired. It is so heartening to know that there are some really big movement in the direction of firming up these laws and helping our friends who have gotten into bad situations. So
I will, thank you.
yeah. I have a couple questions from members. So Representative Love.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Hello. and thank you for your testimony. Ms. Ruth, thank you for your survivor story, your resilience, and your bravery. It was very moving, and I'm so proud of you and happy for you. And thank you for your detailed information. Before I ask my question, I definitely want to give some context to this. I represent a large stretch of the 8 Mile Boulevard and Telegraph Road, and law enforcement in the city of Detroit, Redford Township, our Wayne County Sheriff has been very active and progressive in their approach to try to address these issues, and I've worked with our Redford Township Police in particular with the hotels on Telegraph, and then with Detroit Police and Wayne County Sheriff with the many adult entertainment clubs on 8 Mile, who this has been an issue and definitely been a part of shutting down one that's around the corner from my house a few years ago for having underage girls perform there at the adult. So I appreciate all the work of the advocates in the room and your commission and so forth. So I have a couple of questions for you. In the report card, it mentions that the sex trafficking venues, number 2 listed are hotels and motel based. And in the recommendations, one of the things, you have the recommendations for cosmetologists, the truck drivers, and I'm thinking if a point of entry or a point of contact would be a motel or a restaurant, I don't know that I would mandate a training, but as far as some kind of an indicator that the people here have voluntarily can acknowledge this is a safe place. If you are, that they're wait staff, managers or whatever, if you're in a restaurant facility or if you're a hotel, motel operator, that your front desk clerks, that there is something, is there something that the commission has recommended or that makes available that people can get some type of training and then some certificate or posting that they could post on their door somewhere, you know, we're a place that we can identify this. So if you're one of these perpetrators who have young boys and girls or whoever, they don't have to be young, but people trafficking them for sex or for labor, if you come here, we don't play that. And so the establishment knows that, and then people who need help will know that. If I'm you, Ruth, and I'm trying to run away, and I go to a hotel and I see that sign, I'm hoping that I don't have a negative experience, but that person can then help me. Are we doing anything, or have you proposed anything that would address that?
Included in the list of training was the idea of hospitality workers. We weren't able we weren't able to come to a definite conclusion yet. We have not abandoned any ideas that are on the table, so we continue to work on that. And we think that although it's difficult in mandating training for a sort of unlicensed industry such as the hospitality industry, we are looking at ways that we might be able to employ the Human Trafficking Notification Act, which is already on the books and requires notification to be posted in certain places, ways that we might be able to expand that to include this population, at least as far as information about the trafficking is concerned. As far as a certification for like sort of a trafficking safe locale, we haven't really looked at that, and I'm going to put that on the list because I think that that's a very interesting proposal, so I thank you for that.
Okay, you're welcome, and... Oh, no more? Okay, that's all I can ask you. We'll have to get together later.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
We're sorry, we're going to have to cut off some of the questions. We'll take one more from Representative Frederick, and then we do have other presenters.
Thank you very much, Mr. and Madam Chair. And thank you, Ruth, for laying this out so well in such a compelling format. Through your testimony, you know, we've seen some of the things that traffickers do to exert control, the gaslighting, the drug addiction, shaming, and a criminal record. And I wanted to speak a little bit to what you mentioned on juveniles, because I had some local advocates bring this issue forward, and they're stating that there's still some incongruence between federal law as it relates to age of consent for commercial sex being 18 and then us having the state law where we have some of these pathways of rebuttable presumptions and court discretion and juvenile delinquency and so on. My question is, if minors can't legally consent to commercial sex, why would we have such processes in place rather than treating them as victims in need of care under the CPS model, child advocacy centers, and so on?
So, and this goes back actually to the original framework that was designed as far as protections. There was a number of very difficult discussions and hard work on the part of the folks who were involved in developing the rebuttable presumption approach. Within the statute, the prostitution statute as it is, and it will be continued even under the newly named commercial sexual activity statute, under 16, one cannot be held criminally responsible for an act of prostitution. So the statute says that anyone 16 or older is chargeable for that crime. So there's an absolute protection. So what the rebuttable presumption does is it takes those 16 and 17-year-olds and it says, all right, we are just going to flat out, from the get-go, assume that that is a person who is a victim of human trafficking. Now, that presumption could be overcome by a prosecutor if a prosecutor had evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that in fact somebody was not operating at the hands or under the influence of somebody else. I think it would be a rare circumstance. We had talked about this issue during our work group, and I don't think that there has been a decision not to pursue that, but I don't think that the work isn't yet done in figuring out how to approach that or the way in which to work that into the framework that we have now. Frankly, too, I think that there's we're still looking for a little data on the success of the rebuttable presumption or, frankly, failures of the rebuttable presumption. And if the rebuttable presumption is not protective enough, then that would be adequate justification for us to pursue a different approach. So again, we're looking into that issue, and that's one that continues to be on the table, but hasn't quite worked out itself to be presented just yet in the package that we've put together.
Thank you, and thank you very much
Thank
for
you.
your testimony. Perhaps if there are other questions, they could ask you after but we do have to adjourn.
I would be happy to entertain any questions afterward. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. And before we get to our next presenters, due to FBI regulations, all cameras will be turned off for the next presentation.